Hi friends, today 25th of June, it is one of the most important days in the history of Constitution, in the history of Indian democracy, because in the midnight of 25th of June 1975, emergency was imposed in India. Under Article 352 of Indian Constitution, if central government feels that there is a threat to the internal and external security of the nation, the central government has a right to consider imposing national emergency in the country. That is a constitutional right, of course. But the question arises whether the circumstances justified imposition of emergency. Now I'll tell you a little history why emergency was imposed. In country there was high unemployment. Opposition was extremely active in terms of criticizing the government for not managing its affair well. So there has been agitation. Jayaprakash Narayan was very vocal. Many opposition leaders like Mr. Fernandez, L.K. Advani, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, you name it. There were a number of people who were agitating the way government was trying to run its affairs. Mrs. Gandhi was the Prime Minister. Mrs. Gandhi had contested Raebareli election in 1971 against Rajnarayan ji. Rajnarayan ji was a Lohite socialist leader, and Raebareli was a bastion of Mrs. Gandhi, which continues till now. Of course, Rahul Gandhi has lost for the first time in its bastion, Amethi, against Smriti Irani ji. So, Rajnarayan ji filed a case before the Allahabad High Court, and sometimes around, I think, 12th June, Allahabad High Court convicted Mrs. Gandhi of malpractices, irregularities in the election, because Yashpal Kapoor, who was managing the election of Mrs. Gandhi, was a government employee. And based on that, Justice Sinha, Jagmohan Lal Sinha, disqualified Mrs. Gandhi for 6 years. So, consequently, she was dismembered as the Prime Minister of India and qualified to contest election for 6 years. It was like a death bolt to the ambition of Mrs. Gandhi. Mrs. Gandhi realized that only way to nullify the order of the court is to impose emergency and suspend all the fundamental rights. As a result, in 75, 42nd Constitution Amendment Bill was introduced, which basically restricted the right of judicial review of various high courts in India. It is also called as a mini Constitution of India. Mrs. Gandhi was so strong that none of the cabinet colleagues, which includes former Prime Minister I.K. Gujral, Jagjeevan Ram, V.C. Shukla, all these tall leaders maintained a stoic silence and did not suggest Mrs. Gandhi that this is contrary to the spirit of the Constitution. In Keshwanand Bharti case, it was very clearly set out that basic structure of Indian Constitution cannot be amended or altered. So that was diluted. As a result, secularism and integrity, these are the few words which were introduced in the preamble of Indian Constitution. Fundamental duties were also introduced under Article 51A. So Constitution was basically completely sabotaged. Now Mrs. Gandhi declared emergency on 25th of June in the midnight and introduced an act called MISA. MISA stands for Maintenance of Internal Security Act. Under MISA, without any warrant, government had sweeping powers to arrest anybody without any reason, cause, notice, judicial process, could arrest anybody who is suspected in the subjective discretion of the government subverting or threatening the internal security of the country. At the same time, Mrs. Gandhi used to call, if there is any trouble in the country, there is a foreign hand. So she created a hypothesis, there is an external threat to the integrity of the country. Now, so that was the political or constitutional basis of triggering Article 352, which is absolutely contrary to the spirit of the Constitution, because it is to be used only in very, very exceptional circumstances if there is a war against India. Otherwise, you cannot invoke 352 on frivolous grounds. Now, what has happened is that a lot of politicians, opposition was arrested. Jayaprakash Narayan, who brought total revolution, Sampurna Kranti, and many leaders followed him. They went behind bar. People were arrested overnight. L.K. Advani was arrested. JP was arrested. Many stalwarts of Indian opposition leaders. George Fernandez, who was handcuffed, who was a labor trade union leader, one of the tallest leaders, was put behind the bar. The list is very long. And so you can imagine, without rhyme or reason, the police knocked the door and arrested in the middle of night many leaders. One of my senior colleagues and my guru, D.P. Tripathi, who was the first president of Jawaharlal Nehru University, he was arrested, put underground for 2 years. So there are many politicians who were arrested because government did not allow any democratic expression of protest against the existing government. So all the fundamental rights were suspended, like habeas corpus, certiorari, many other writ petitions you could not file as a citizen of India. If you are arrested wrongfully or there is a wrongful confinement, you cannot go to the high courts with habeas corpus because it's a unlawful detention and get the accused released. Only very few influential people could get released under parole. So friends, there was a complete muzzling of the democratic dissent under emergency from 75 to 77. Sanjay Gandhi, who was like a crown prince, Mrs. Gandhi's youngest son, who was literally running the de facto government. He forced people for mass vasectomization, sterilization. A lot of bachelors were picked up from home by the district administration to meet the target, and they were sterilized. नसबंदी जिसको कहते हैं, ऐसे लोग जो कि कुंवारे थे उनकी भी नसबंदी हो गई. बहुत इनडिस्क्रिमिनेट तरीके से countrywide campaign was unleashed by the sycophant administrators who were scared of the authority of Mrs. Gandhi. And they sterilized people irrespective of whatever it is. So they wanted to ruthlessly meet the target. The bulldozer was basically moved around Jama Masjid. A lot of structures were demolished overnight. Sanjay Gandhi was a mini dictator in the country. The entire cabinet of Mrs. Gandhi's government had been receiving commands and instruction from Sanjay Gandhi directly. So, similarly, in the Bollywood industry, just to establish that everything is normal, they organized a concert which was anchored by Dilip Kumar Sahab. Sanjay ji was there on stage. Amjad Khan was delivering his dialogues from Sholay because on 15th August 1975, that is during emergency, film Sholay was released. And all these guys were made to dance at the tune of Sanjay Gandhi. These guys performed a free of cost concert so that impression goes around the world that everything is normal. R.D. Burman performed on stage. Then Sanjay ji wanted Manoj Kumar ji to make a film justifying emergency. But Manoj Kumar ji refused. As a result, he suffered a huge loss. Similarly, Devanand, Goldie Anand, his brother, he refused. Kishore Kumar, he refused to perform a public concert. As a result, his songs were banned in All India Radio. His songs were banned in television. Doordarshan was the time when only Doordarshan was the major channel. Including Kissa Kursi Ka, which was banned. Andhi, which was made by Gulzar Sahib, that film was banned. Any film, including Sholay, the climax was distorted because there was some kind of objectionable piece there. In one movie, the word Janta was completely eliminated and it was replaced by Praja. Coming to the press, what Lal Krishna Advani ji said, which is a very famous quotation while he was giving interview to Z television, that these journalists, I'm talking about emergency period, 75 to 77, were asked to bow down. थोड़ा सा झुकने के लिए क्या कहा सरकार ने, वो तो रेंगने लगे. They started crawling. So most of the journalists became sycophants and they started supporting emergency in India, which is absolutely a death blow to the fourth estate. That is the pillar of democracy. The freedom of expression is a pillar is an important pillar of democracy. Goenka ji, who used to run Indian Express, was the only newspaper which had been talking against emergency and refusing and ran the paper at its own cost. So there were few strong, brave journalists like Ramnath Goenka ji who continued to publish his Indian Express. Most of the publications which were anti-government were banned. The journalists, around 250 journalists were arrested overnight because they were anti-government. Publications which were anti-government were completely suspended or their license was withdrawn. Nobody had the guts to speak a word against the government. Everybody was terrorized Every citizen of the country was terrorized. Nobody had the power because the moment you say a word, the police will come and round you up and put you under MISA. MISA was a very draconian act, Maintenance of Internal Security Act. There was no threat to internal security. There was no threat to external sources. It was a fabricated circumstances which Mrs. Gandhi created a fort around herself to circumvent the Allahabad High Court orders of disqualifying her for 6 years. Now, what was happening is there was complete chaos. International opinion was building up against India. Mrs. Gandhi was advised by one of the British politicians to release George Fernandez. As a result, she was brought under tremendous pressure internationally that India was criticized across the globe for imposing emergency which was not justified by any stretch of imagination. So opinion was building up against this revolution like JP, Sampoorn Kranti, Total Revolution, was building up to its crescendo. The youth was joining. There was complete opposition simmering, and Mrs. Gandhi somehow realized that it's perhaps time for her to review. Then she engaged in Intelligence Bureau, IB, to find out her popularity rating. Now, everybody was terrorized. Nobody had the word to say against Mrs. Gandhi. So IB gave her an opinion that if you hold the election, I'm talking about in 77, then you will win the election. Twice the survey was conducted. And both the times, IB, Intelligence Bureau, confirmed that Mrs. Gandhi, you are going to win hands down. Now, what has happened is that was the wrong opinion. That was opinion to please Mrs. Gandhi's ear. Mrs. Gandhi, if had received, I think thanks to IB, Intelligence Bureau, that they gave a wrong survey report to Mrs. Gandhi, otherwise emergency would have continued for sine die for indefinite period. So that was good for the country. It's a blessing in disguise that she was misreported by the IB that she is going to win the election. Sanjay Gandhi contested from Amethi against Ravindra Pratap Singh. He literally lost his deposit there. He had to run away on the date of counting because he was completely smashed by a very small leader from Sultanpur, Ravindra Pratap Singh, and he defeated Sanjay Gandhi. He left with literally, people were up in arms when the elections were held based on the report of IB. Most of the congressmen lost elections throughout the country, and there was a formation of Janata Party in 1977 under the leadership of Shri Morarji Desai. Morarji Desai was perhaps the first Gujarati Prime Minister of India who was very Puritan, Gandhian, had a tall leadership, and a strict administrator. So a lot of political parties came under the umbrella of Janata Party and formed the coalition government and swept the elections in India. But it was a coalition. So they started fighting, they banned cola, they tried to bring lots of changes, but coalition was ridden with internal factions because it was an amalgamation of many political parties against Congress. So there were infighting, there were internal conflicts, there were inherent ideological differences. So what happened was Janata Party fell apart. And in 1980, The elections were declared, and Mrs. Gandhi once again swept the elections and came back into power. So, friends, why I discuss this matter with you, it's a very old issue, 75. Younger generation may not be aware how the democracy was crushed by Mrs. Gandhi. And we have to be on our guards. Because the way in 1977, every citizen of this country was involved in the political process because it was a matter of their posterity, their future. They even donated money from their own pocket to support the candidates who were fighting against Congress. So it was a people's movement. The people's movement restored the democracy in India. It doesn't matter, they lost it, but people in this country were enlightened not to allow any dictatorship or autocrats to rule the country. That's why they smashed Mrs. Gandhi. And so, friends, it's very important that we need to protect our constitution because that's the backbone, the spinal cord of the polity of this country. Separation of power. The judiciary needs to be independent. The legislature has to be independent in its influence. Legislature should not influence the judiciary at all. Executive has to perform, abide by the right orders. What we have seen is executive tends to become conformist. I think it's a high time that they need to uphold the constitutional value, the rule of the law. There may be few casualties, but doesn't matter. The country is much bigger than people's individual limited ambitions. Individuals' limited ambitions cannot hold the country to ransom. They need to sacrifice their comfort. They need to come forward what is tenable, what is constitutionally compliant. So my request to executive and legislature both, that they need to perform their functions constitutionally in the interest of the nation. And if there is something which is going wrong, I think one should raise the voice. And that's the beauty of democracy. The people, on the other hand, they need to be aware of their rights. Like Mr. Modi, for example, I think is a gift to the nation. He's working relentlessly 18 to 20 hours a day without a single day off. He does not celebrate his Diwali with his family. He goes on the border. Looking at the geopolitical situation in India right now, where we are surrounded by two formidable enemies, China and Pakistan, I think India needs to emerge as a very strong military country. So there is a lot of efforts, energy required by the government to strengthen the army. With the corona coming in, which is again crippling the economy, but under Mr. Modi's rule, the stock market is doing extremely well. And I'll not be surprised, despite all debacles, maybe the GDP is shrinking, but with the ability of Mr. Modi and his government, I'm very sure they will achieve $5 trillion economy. Atmanirbhar Bharat, New India. So we need to create a new India. Like in 1948, China's GDP was lower than India's GDP. Till 1975, India was ahead. So why we are lagging behind? We are lagging behind because when we don't need to politicize the system, we politicize there. For example, I'm not trying to be political here. Farmers' protest is something which is absolutely fabricated and created. You have seen how the national flag was replaced in Red Fort. Is it the legitimate demand? When they are asking for reforms in the laws, which was again supported by Congress and many other political parties who are opposing now, when Mr. Modi brought out the same laws which were supported by Congress, now they are objecting to it. So politics has a limitations. If politics start intruding into the fundamentals of the nation's growth, then I think it's a gangrene. We need to eliminate it. We all respect farmers. They are our andatas. India was a primarily is a agricultural economy. We export. We are the we have created record production of wheat grains, but we need to create storage capacity. People criticize about Essential Commodities Act because hoarding was not permitted, but hoarding was the function of deficiency of food grains. Now India is producing so much of food grain, so we need to create a storage capacity. So if we continue to make it a criminal or punitive provision that you cannot hoard, then how will you create additional storage capacity? So that's perfectly legitimate. Anybody can come forward to create a cold storages and storage capacity, warehousing, because we need to store grains. We have seen in rains the grains are getting completely rancid. They're getting destroyed in the water. So what is the need? Why are we challenging this? Similarly, the minimum support pricing, it was never part of the act. So Mr. Modi has not repealed the existing act and trying to remove MSP from the act. It was never there. So what is Mr. Modi's fault? No, it is completely a political agenda, friends. So we need to support the legitimate needs, because if we get hyper political in our attitude and start compromising on the national interest, friends, let me assure you, you may not suffer, but your coming generation, your posterity, your children, they will suffer, because we will become a weak country. And already China, in collusion with Pakistan, are trying to sabotage, disintegrate our country. In South China Sea, they have so many submarines patrolling. They are already usurping the exclusive economic zone of the littoral states like Vietnam and many other countries in that Indian Ocean. And they are building up CPAC through Pakistan so that they can reach to Gwadar port. In Indian Ocean, where major cargoes are moved by China to other parts of the world like Africa and all, India can play a very important role. So Pakistan and China coming together against India, they have even hostile Nepal. Nepal had been talking against, which is the only Hindu state. So it became literally like a China colony. So our geopolitical situation is extremely fragile. But thanks to Modi government, they are very strong. The defense minister is spending day in day out in reviewing the defense preparedness. So friends, if we continue to make it political, every agenda of the Modi government is politicized by the opposition without any substantial ground. Like in Rafale, they have been raising all kinds of dirty noises against Prime Minister. And finally, Rahul ji had to apologize 2 or 3 times before the court. Yes, it was a wrong propaganda. We need a strategic addition. Rafale is a strategic addition. We have already delayed the arrival of Rafale because of this politics. So what I'm trying to say is, I can go on and go on. We need to learn the lessons from the history. We need to ensure that there's no repetition of emergency in India. The citizens have to be vigilant. They must have the right and the wisdom to analyze right and wrong. Only this country can go up. At the same time, we also need to bring lots of reforms, labor laws reforms. We have to take little back seat and put the country on the driving seat so that all our energy is channelized in order to build new India Friends, thank you very much.